Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about chapter 19 on the blood, which is the third of the three chapters dealing with cardiovascular system. First thing we'll look at, of course, are some of the main functions of the blood, and we'll be talking about some of these functions, most of these functions throughout the course of the chapter and in lab. And so some of the information in this chapter we'll be covering directly in the lab setting. So let's look at some of the functions. Number one, gas exchange is what we'll be talking about, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we'll talk a little bit about oxygen transport here, but also when we get to the respiratory system, because both of these systems are involved with gas exchange. But also for number two, transporting molecules. And so your blood, this is a primary function of the blood, is to be a transport medium throughout the body. And so it's transporting all kinds of molecules, including hormones, just like we saw back in chapter 16, transporting nutrients. This could be glucose or amino acids or, whatever type of nutrient that the body needs is transporting this throughout the body. And then any waste products that are created in the body that have to be excreted. And so number two is it transports various molecules. Number three, this is where you find your part of your defense mechanisms for the body inside of the blood, because you have things called antibodies. Most everybody's familiar with antibodies. We'll look closer into antibodies in the lymphatic chapter. But here, antibodies are basically proteins that help fight off infection. And then WBCs, that's my abbreviation for white blood cells. And so we'll be talking about white blood cells in this chapter and also in lab. Maintaining body temperature, that's critical. It's basically heat homeostasis and heat distribution. And so the blood is important to help distribute that heat that the body generates throughout the body. Then on the next slide, a few more functions for you. Clot formation, it's a very important function of the blood to be able to form a clot when it is needed. And we'll be talking about a 5-step process in order to form clots and some of the chemistry involved in forming that clot. The number 6, regulation of body fluid pH or blood pH in this case. That's very critical. And so if you're not familiar with pH, we'll talk a little bit about that in some of the chapters that we cover. Here you see pH of the body fluids, or the blood in this case, should be between 7.35 and 7.45. And you probably covered a little bit about pH back in chapter 2. Just remember that pH is a measure of how acidic or basic a solution is. And a pH of 7 is neutral. And so this is actually slightly basic. This is a little above neutral. And so this is maintained in a very narrow range. And throughout the remaining of the semester, we'll be talking about this pH range. Is very important, and we'll see different factors that help to balance out the body's pH. And then also, as we've seen the relationship before between blood volume and blood pressure, blood volume helps to stabilize your blood pressure. And so there is a correlation between blood pressure and blood volume. The higher your blood volume is, that creates a higher blood pressure. And so that's another main function of the blood. So the next thing to look at is what is the blood made of, what's in the blood. And really you can divide it into two main parts here. The liquid portion, that's known as plasma, and then the cellular portion, that's called formed elements. And so we'll be talking about each one of these and kind of giving you some information about what you can find in each one of these. The plasma, again, that's the liquid portion. What they've done in this test tube here is they've taken a sample of blood and they put it in a centrifuge. And that basically spins the sample down. It separates out the blood. Anything dense or denser, heavier, really goes to the bottom of the test tube when you centrifuge it. And then the less dense material, in this case the plasma, kind of remains and sits on top. So everything on the bottom is what's called the formed elements. That's where you're going to find the blood cells and any cellular fragments such as platelets, which we'll look at in a few minutes. I found this chart here in a different textbook. I think it does a good job of kind of illustrating it still shows you the same two parts of the blood, the plasma, the formed elements, and then it breaks down each of the divisions here and kind of shows you what's inside of each one. So, for example, the plasma makes up about 55% of a blood sample. A little over half of that blood sample would be called plasma, and inside of the plasma you can see has mostly water. There's also some proteins dissolved, and there's something called other solutes. And then the graph or the figure kind of shows you what each one of these kind of accounts for. So, for example, proteins, there's 3 examples of proteins. We'll look at these kind of briefly: albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. And then also you have some other dissolved solutes, things that are dissolved in the plasma, such as ions, nutrients, waste products, gases, and regulatory substances, which is just another way of saying hormones and enzymes. And then if you look at the bottom of the figure, the formed elements, really there's 3, the red blood cells, and then the buffy coat here. This little layer here shows up white because it has lots of these white blood cells, and then platelets are all part of this little zone down here. White blood cells, we'll talk about white blood cells individually in lab, but it lists out the 5 major categories or groups of white blood cells: neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So let's take a look at the blood plasma and see what's inside of it. First of all, a couple of things about the plasma. It is a liquid portion of the blood. It is basically a colloid. Now, that's a chemistry definition here. It's basically some kind of a liquid that contains, it's a suspension. And so it has things suspended in it, including these proteins. It's basically water, 91% water. And then it has proteins and various things suspended in it. And then it does have some things dissolved in it as well. And so we'll talk about some of these things like the ions and nutrients and all of this on the next slide. So here's kind of a breakdown. You don't need to know every single one of these. It's probably good to know an example of each of the categories, but we'll go through most of these. Ions, those are charged atoms. So for example, hydrogen ions or chloride ions or sodium or potassium. You've probably talked about them, 168. And so these ions help to balance out fluids, and that's for osmosis. They help for your membrane potential, so your sodium and potassium that you had to set up an action potential or resting membrane potential. Acid and base balance, that's primarily the hydrogen ion, because that's really what an acid or base is. It's a measurement of how many hydrogen ions you have. So all of these ions can be dissolved inside of your blood plasma. Various nutrients are there, like glucose, we kind of mentioned that earlier, amino acids, fats or lipids, triacylglycerol, that's a type of a lipid or fat. Cholesterol, you've heard about. Cholesterol, that's important for your cell membranes. And then various vitamins are carried around in your plasma as well. Take a look at some of the waste products you'll find inside of your plasma. Urea and uric acid, creatinine, ammonia salts, these are all byproducts or breakdown products from when you digest and metabolize proteins. You break those down and they produce some waste products. Your body has to get rid of those waste products. And so it's the job of the blood, in this case, the plasma, to transport those to the kidneys, where the kidneys can filter out the waste. Bilirubin, this is a breakdown product of red blood cells. It's basically a pigment, and we'll actually talk about this a little more in the urinary system. We do a lab for this. But this is a pigment that normally gets broken down, but it is carried over to the liver where it is further broken down. And then lactic acid. Sometimes you hear a little bit about lactic acid in Bio 168 when you talk about muscle cells, and sometimes muscle cells go through a type of anaerobic type respiration in which they produce lactic acid. You can see a list of the gases that are transported in the plasma. These are actually dissolved, can be dissolved in the plasma, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and some nitrogen as well. And then regulatory substances, which would include all the hormones we talked about in chapter 16, and then various enzymes. And then lastly, for the plasma, you've got three groups of proteins. We'll talk about these briefly, and we're going to see some of these proteins in other chapters as well. Albumins, these help with the viscosity or kind of the thickness of the blood. They also help with creating an osmotic pressure that allows certain osmosis events to take place. That's moving fluids in and out of the bloodstream. Some of these help buffer, and so they help to balance pH. Some of these are transport proteins, and so they help to transport different molecules such as fatty acids or lipids, and even thyroid hormones require some kind of protein as a transporter. Some globulins here are listed here. They also help in transporting molecules such as lipids and carbs, hormones. Even some ions have to have a globulin type protein to transport. Your antibodies are globulins. And so there's a word that we'll look at in the chapter on lymphatics, which is an immunoglobulin. And so that's just another name for an antibody. Also, we'll talk more about complement later. This is also a protein that's found in the blood that is part of your immune system. We'll talk more about that in a later chapter. Then fibrinogen, this is a third type of protein found in the plasma. We'll talk a little bit about this one at the end of this chapter, and because it does involve the blood clotting process. All right, section 2 begins talking about the formed elements, and so we'll talk about the three main types of formed elements: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Some of this section we'll be doing in lab, and so I'll be skipping over some things, and that we'll cover those in lab. But here you see red blood cells. Make sure you know the anatomical term for red blood cells is erythrocytes, and you see some characteristics here of red blood cells or erythrocytes listed here. They are biconcave. That just means they have a kind of a depression. You can see, especially in the side view, a depression in the cell on both sides. Both sides are kind of depressed in. They're also anucleate. It just means that they do not have a nucleus after they're formed. After they finish their formation in the red bone marrow, then they do not have a nucleus, so they are anucleate. Their main function here is to transport gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. The other thing is about red blood cells, they only last about 3 or 4 months in circulation. And then your spleen will break down any older or broken down red blood cells. And like I said, that's about 120 days or 3 or 4 months.